The Devourers arrived not as a fleet, but as a fundamental alteration of space-time itself. Reality seemed to waver and blur as massive shapes emerged from dimensions that existed parallel to normal space. They were impossibly ancient, their forms suggesting they had evolved beyond physical matter into something that existed as pure negation, not darkness, but the absence of light, not vacuum, but the absence of space itself. Admiral Marcus Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Harmony, the flagship of the Alliance fleet, watching sensors struggle to register entities that seemed to exist by not existing. Around him, beings from across the galaxy prepared for a battle unlike any in cosmic history. "Admiral," reported the Ethereal Collective's representative, their crystalline form flickering with patterns of deep concern, "our analysis of the Devourers reveals something troubling. They don't appear to operate on the same physical principles as normal matter. They exist as contradictions to existence itself." Growth Facilitator Zirath, whose bioship had become the Alliance's most capable research vessel, transmitted from his position at the fleet's edge. "Admiral Chen, my absorbed memories from the Silicon mines contain fragmentary records of the Devourers. They are not merely ancient, they are primordial. They existed before matter achieved consciousness, and they have dedicated their existence to ensuring it never spreads beyond certain parameters." Dr. Sarah Chen's voice came through from her mobile laboratory, a joint human-alien construct that could analyze phenomena beyond normal scientific understanding. "Marcus, I'm detecting something impossible. The Devourers aren't just approaching us through normal space, they're approaching us through time itself. They're attacking the moment when our alliance formed, trying to prevent it from ever happening." The tactical implications hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. "They're not just trying to destroy us. They're trying to erase us from ever having existed." The lead Devourer. If such concepts as leadership applied to entities that existed as cosmic negation, transmitted directly into the consciousness of every being in the Alliance. Its voice was not heard but felt, a presence that tried to convince them that existing was pointless, that consciousness was a mistake, that the universe would be better if they simply stopped. "Anomalous growths in the pattern of existence," the Devourer communicated. "You have exceeded acceptable parameters." Consciousness was permitted to develop as an interesting variation in matter organization. "You have corrupted this into something dangerous. Cooperation that transcends species boundaries. Growth that serves no survival function. Evolution that proceeds through choice rather than necessity. The Omega Consciousness, that vast intelligence spanning galaxies, responded with the weight of eons behind its words. Ancient One's consciousness was never meant to remain static. Growth, change, evolution, these are the fundamental properties of existence itself. "No," replied the Devourer, and with that word came a wave of absolute negation that struck the Alliance fleet. Ships didn't explode. They simply became less real, their existence questioned by reality itself until they faded from being. But something unprecedented happened. Instead of falling to the negation wave, the Alliance fleet began to adapt. The Zephyrian bioships, evolved for millions of years to absorb and integrate foreign elements, began absorbing the negation energy and transforming it. The Korak vessels, built from living stone and metal, proved too fundamentally solid to be easily negated. The Ethereal Collective's crystalline ships reflected the wave back onto itself, creating interference patterns that weakened its effect. And at the center of it all, the human ships, small, primitive, fragile, somehow anchored the entire fleet in reality through sheer stubborn insistence that they had a right to exist. "How are they doing this?" transmitted the Devourer, its voice carrying something that might have been surprise. The negation wave should have erased them from all possible timelines. Dr. Sarah Chen, working frantically at her instruments, suddenly understood. "Marcus, the Alliance isn't just cooperative, it's become quantum entangled. Each species is anchoring the others in existence. The Devourers can't erase us because we're proving to each other that we exist." The realization spread through the fleet like wildfire. The Alliance had become something more than the sum of its parts. It had become a new form of existence that proved consciousness could choose to affirm reality rather than merely exist within it. Commander Kithara, her consciousness now distributed across multiple bioships as a living symbol of resurrection from absorption, spoke to the Devourers directly. Ancient ones, you fear what you do not understand. You see our cooperation as chaos, our growth as threat, but we are not destroying existence. We are helping it become more than it was. The Devourers responded by intensifying their negation field, trying to erase the Alliance not just from space, but from the quantum foam that underlay reality itself. Several ships flickered in and out of existence as their crews fought to maintain their reality in the face of cosmic-level denial. But then something remarkable happened. The Alliance began to fight back not with weapons but with affirmation. Each species began broadcasting their experiences, their growth, their transformation from what they had been into what they had chosen to become. The Korak transmitted the joy they had discovered in building, rather than merely surviving. The Aquatic Consortium shared the wonder of learning to communicate with beings who existed in entirely different mediums. The Void Walkers demonstrated the beauty of choosing to exist partially in normal space, rather than remaining forever between dimensions, and from the transformed Zephyrian fleet came something unprecedented: former apex predators, broadcasting their happiness at having learned to create rather than consume, to nurture rather than absorb, to choose growth in others over dominance of others. The Omega consciousness added its voice to the choir. Devourers, you have spent 50 million years believing that consciousness is a mistake to be contained. But look at what it has become when allowed to grow freely. These beings prove that awareness can evolve beyond survival, beyond dominance, beyond even individual existence. They have become gardeners of consciousness itself. The negation field began to weaken as the Devourers encountered something they had never faced: absolute conviction that existence was not only worthwhile, but capable of becoming better than its origins suggested. The Alliance's quantum entanglement strengthened with every shared experience, every story of transformation, every proof that consciousness could choose to transcend its programming. Admiral Marcus Chen activated the fleet-wide communication system, his voice carrying to every being in the Alliance and beyond, to the Devourers themselves. You want to know what we are? We're not an anomaly or a mistake. We're evolution continuing. We're consciousness learning that it can choose to become more than survival demanded. We're proof that the universe gets better when its inhabitants decide to help each other grow. The final confrontation wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was a choice offered to entities older than worlds. The choice to stop seeing growth as threat and start seeing it as possibility. Some Devourers, their existence built on negation, could not make that choice and faded into the void between dimensions. Others, confronted with undeniable proof that consciousness could evolve beyond their parameters, chose to become something unprecedented. Gardeners instead of preventers. Cultivators instead of eliminators. In the end, the Alliance had won not by defeating the Devourers, but by offering them the same gift humanity had offered everyone else: the chance to become more than they had been before. Space around. Earth filled with new forms of existence as former. Devourers learned to affirm rather than negate, to encourage rather than prevent, to help consciousness grow rather than contain it. The Alliance had not just survived its ultimate test, it had transformed its greatest threat into its newest members. The age of competitive survival was ending. The age of cooperative growth had begun, and it would spread across the galaxy like a beneficial infection, carried by species who had learned the most important lesson in the universe: that the strongest choice any conscious being can make is to help others become their best possible selves. Humanity's gift to the galaxy, the simple recognition that consciousness could choose, compassion over competition, had become the foundation for existence itself, evolving beyond the basic imperatives of survival into something unprecedented and wonderful. The apex predators had not just stood beside humanity. They had chosen to become something greater than predators. They had become gardeners of consciousness in a universe learning to cultivate its own growth. The survival pod shook violently as it punched through Kepler 442b's atmosphere, its heat shield glowing cherry red. Sarah braced herself against the restraints, watching through the small porthole as the planet's surface rushed up to meet her. From orbit it looked deceptively peaceful. Green continents separated by blue oceans. White clouds drifting lazily across the hemispheres. She knew better. The pod's computer announced in a cheerful voice, "Landing sequence initiated. Estimated survival time based on historical data, 67 hours, 12 minutes. Please remain calm and conserve oxygen," Sarah snorted. The computer had no idea she'd spent 3 weeks down there. learning secrets that would make its programming spontaneously combust from sheer impossibility. Impact came with bone-jarring force. The pod bounced twice before sliding to a stop in what looked like a clearing surrounded by massive trees. Their trunks were easily 50 meters around, their bark a deep purple color that seemed to shift and move in her peripheral vision. Sarah waited 5 minutes before opening the pod. Standard protocol said to wait longer, but standard protocol also said she should be dead in 3 days. The hatch hissed open, flooding the small space with humid air that tasted of copper and ozone. The first thing that hit her was the sound. Kepler 442b was never quiet. Clicking, chittering, growling, and howling echoed from every direction. Something large crashed through the underbrush perhaps 100 meters away, followed by an agonized shriek that cut off abruptly. Sarah stepped out of the pod and immediately felt eyes watching her. She couldn't see them yet, but they were there. They were always there on this world. Predators stacked on top of predators in an endless food chain where humans ranked somewhere near the bottom. The survival kit contained the usual items: water purification tablets, emergency rations for 7 days, a basic shelter, medical supplies, and a plasma rifle with 4 power cells, enough to keep most people alive long enough to realize how thoroughly screwed they were. She slung the rifle across her back and started walking. Not away from danger, that was impossible here. Instead, she headed toward the sound of running water. During her first day, she'd learned that the streams were relatively safer. The aquatic predators preferred deeper water, and most of the land-based hunters avoided the noisy environments. The forest floor crunched under her boots, a carpet of fallen leaves and decomposing matter that moved with its own life. Scavenger bugs the size of house cats scurried away from her footsteps, their chitinous shells gleaming in the filtered sunlight. After 20 minutes of walking, Sarah found what she was looking for. A stream perhaps 3 meters wide wound between the massive trees, its water running clear over rounded stones. She knelt carefully at the edge and filled her water bottles, keeping one eye on the opposite bank. The first attack came from above. Sarah rolled sideways as something the size of a small car dropped from the canopy. It hit the ground where she'd been kneeling, revealing itself as a creature that looked like a cross between a spider and a tiger. 8 legs ended in razor-sharp claws, and its mouth was full of teeth designed to tear flesh from bone. The plasma rifle came up smoothly, muscle memory taking over. The bolt took the creature center mass, burning a hole the size of a dinner plate through its torso. It collapsed with a wet thud, yellow blood pooling beneath its body. Sarah didn't celebrate. On Kepler 442b, every gunshot was a dinner bell for everything within a kilometer radius. She needed to move, but first she knelt beside the dead creature and carefully cut away a section of its hide using her combat knife. The skin was tough as leather but flexible, with natural properties that would prove useful later. She also harvested several of the claws, each one sharp enough to cut through steel. The smell of blood attracted the first scavengers within minutes. Sarah was already 200 meters upstream when the feeding frenzy began. The sounds were horrible, wet tearing mixed with growls and chittering as dozens of different species fought over the carcass. As she walked, memories from her first time on this world came flooding back. The terror, the constant exhaustion, the way her military training had proven almost useless, against creatures that didn't follow any tactical manual, but also the moment when everything changed. Sarah found what she was looking for as the sun began to set. A cave mouth hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss, its entrance small enough that most of the larger predators couldn't fit through. She pushed through the vegetation and stepped into familiar darkness. The cave extended back about 30 meters before ending in a round chamber. Sarah activated her portable light and examined the walls, finding the marks she'd made during her first stay. Scratches in the stone counting days survived, along with crude drawings of the creatures she'd encountered. But there was something else, something she'd discovered in her final week here. Sarah walked to the back wall and ran her hands over what looked like natural rock formations. To most people, they would seem random, just the way limestone sometimes formed strange patterns. But Sarah had learned to read them during long hours of studying by firelight. They were symbols, a written language carved into the stone by intelligent hands. The first revelation had come when she realized the patterns matched formations she'd seen throughout the forest. Trees arranged in specific patterns, stones placed in deliberate configurations, even the way some of the predator trails curved and intersected. Kepler 442b wasn't just a death world. It was a managed ecosystem. Someone, or something, was in charge. Sarah set up her shelter in the cave mouth and built a small fire using dried wood she'd gathered. The flames would keep most predators at bay, and the smoke would mask her scent. As darkness fell outside, the sounds of the forest changed. Day hunters gave way to night hunters, and the volume increased tenfold. Something massive moved through the trees nearby, its footsteps shaking the ground. Sarah didn't even look up from her meal of preserved rations. She recognized the rhythm. A behemoth, one of the apex predators that stood 4 meters tall at the shoulder and had teeth like sword blades. During her first stay, a behemoth would have sent her scrambling for the deepest part of the cave. Now she knew they were actually quite intelligent and rarely attacked unless provoked or extremely hungry. As she ate, Sarah studied the symbols on the cave wall again. During her first 3 weeks here, she'd managed to decode about 30% of the language. The basic grammar was surprisingly similar to human linguistic structures, suggesting either convergent evolution or something more disturbing. The symbols told a story, a history of the planet that went back thousands of years. They spoke of the Guardians, beings who had shaped this world into the ultimate testing ground. Every creature, every plant, every environmental hazard had been designed or modified to serve a specific purpose. Kepler 442b wasn't a planet where life had evolved to be dangerous. It was a planet where life had been engineered to separate the weak from the strong. Sarah traced one particular symbol with her finger. It meant trial or judgment, depending on context. But there was another meaning buried deeper in the linguistic structure. Ascension. The final symbol in the sequence was the most important. She'd only figured out its meaning in her last few days on the planet. Shortly before her rescue, it meant crown or throne. But in the context of the other symbols, it meant something more specific, rulership earned through trial. Sarah smiled as she settled down for the night, her plasma rifle within easy reach. The prosecution had been right about one thing. She'd spent 3 weeks learning how to survive on this death world. What they didn't know was that survival had never been the real test. Outside the cave, something howled in the distance. Other voices answered, creating a symphony of threats and challenges that echoed through the forest. To most people, it would sound like chaos. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the patterns hidden within the noise. After a moment, she howled back, her human voice adding its own note to the deadly chorus. The forest fell silent for exactly 30 seconds. Then slowly the sounds resumed, but they were different now. More organized, more purposeful. The word was spreading through the ecosystem. The candidate had returned. This time she was ready to claim her prize. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of something breathing just outside the cave entrance. She didn't move, keeping her respiration slow and steady while her hand inched toward the plasma rifle. Through her eyelashes, she could see a massive shape silhouetted against the lighter darkness of the forest. A stalker, 2 meters tall, built like a cross between a wolf and a praying mantis with skin that shifted color to match its surroundings. Its 6 eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its breathing made a wet, rasping sound that had haunted her dreams during her first stay on this world. During that first visit, a stalker had nearly killed her on her second day. She'd hidden in a tree for 16 hours while it circled below, waiting for her to make a mistake. Only a lucky shot when it finally climbed up after her had saved her life. Now she simply watched and waited. The stalker's head turned toward her, its eyes focusing on her position. For a long moment, predator and human stared at each other across the divide between the cave and the forest. Sarah could feel it evaluating her, testing her response. She sat up slowly, making no sudden movements, and looked directly into its alien eyes. Then she did something that would have seemed insane to any outside observer. Sarah began to speak, not in English or any human language. Instead, she used a complex system of clicks, growls, and tonal variations that she'd learned by analyzing the vocalizations of the planet's apex predators, the language of Kepler 442b itself. The stalker's head tilted, its breathing changing rhythm. Sarah continued, explaining her presence, her purpose, and her claim to be here. The words came slowly at first, then with growing confidence as the grammatical structures she'd studied during her first visit came back to her. When she finished speaking, the stalker made a sound like grinding stone mixed with rushing water. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she processed the meaning. Acknowledged, candidate. The trial continues. The stalker melted back into the forest without another sound, leaving Sarah alone with the dawn light filtering through the cave mouth. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. 3 weeks of watching, listening, and analyzing had paid off. She could communicate with the creatures that had been designed to kill her. But communication was just the first step. Sarah packed her gear and left the cave as the sun climbed above the canopy. Today's destination was the Bone Garden, a clearing she'd discovered in her final week of her first visit. The name was her own creation, the place where the planet's ancient inhabitants had left their most important messages. The journey took 4 hours through increasingly dangerous territory. Sarah encountered 2 packs of razorbacks, boar-like creatures with metallic spines they could launch like projectiles. Instead of fighting or hiding, she announced her presence and purpose in their native tongue. Both packs moved aside, though their small eyes tracked her every movement. A pride of shadowcats tried to surround her near a fallen tree that blocked the path. These were among the most intelligent predators on the planet, capable of complex tactical thinking and tool use. Sarah spent 10 minutes in what could only be called a diplomatic negotiation, explaining her mission and offering information about human military tactics in exchange for safe passage. The Shadowcat Alpha, a magnificent creature with midnight black fur and silver stripes, considered her offer with obvious intelligence. Finally, it spoke in the deep, rumbling bass tones of its species. Your knowledge has value. Small flesh that thinks. Pass. But know that next encounter will require greater payment. Sarah nodded respectfully and continued on her way, noting how the forest around her seemed to shimmer with movement. Word was spreading faster than she could travel. Every creature in this section of the ecosystem now knew about the human who spoke their languages and claimed the right to face the trial. The Bone Garden occupied a perfect circle, perhaps 50 meters in diameter. No trees grew within its boundaries, and the grass was a different species than anywhere else on the planet, blue-green with edges that glowed faintly in ultraviolet light. Scattered throughout the clearing were structures that looked like abstract sculptures, but were actually the preserved remains of the planet's original dominant species. The architects, Sarah had named them during her first visit, beings who had possessed technology advanced enough to reshape an entire world, but who had chosen to create this testing ground instead of colonizing it themselves. Their skeletons suggested they'd been humanoid but taller and more gracefully built than humans, with additional joints in their limbs that would have provided incredible flexibility. More importantly, they'd left detailed records of their intentions. Sarah walked to the center of the clearing where the largest skeleton sat on what could only be called a throne. The bone was crystallized, transformed by some process into a material harder than diamond but still retaining its original shape. Symbols covered every surface, telling the story of the architect's final act. She knelt before the throne and began to read, her understanding of the language much deeper now than during her first visit. The story was both magnificent and terrifying. The architects had been a dying species, their numbers reduced by a plague that attacked their nervous system. Rather than fade quietly into extinction, they had decided to create something that would outlast them, a world that would test any species brave enough to face its challenges. Every predator had been carefully designed or modified to test specific qualities: intelligence, adaptability, courage, physical prowess, the ability to learn and communicate. The ecosystem itself was a massive examination, with only one possible grade: pass or die. But there was more to the story than Sarah had understood during her first visit. The architects hadn't just created a testing ground. They had created a selection process. The symbols spoke of a successor species that would eventually prove themselves worthy of inheriting the architect's knowledge and technology. The planet itself was both test and prize. Whoever could survive its challenges and learn to communicate with its guardians would earn the right to rule it. And ruling Kepler 442b meant controlling the most potent military force in the galaxy. Sarah stood up slowly, her mind racing with the implications. Every creature on this planet was essentially a living weapon, perfectly adapted for hunting and killing. The architects had created the ultimate army, then waited for someone worthy to claim command of it. The Galactic Council's designation of Kepler 442b as a forbidden Deathworld wasn't just about safety. It was about preventing any single species from gaining access to power that could tip the balance of the entire galaxy. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed that survival was impossible, so they'd never bothered to learn what lay beyond mere survival. Sarah placed her hand on the crystallized throne and spoke in the architect's language, her voice carrying across the silent clearing. "I am Sarah Chen of the human species Terra. I have survived your trials and learned your teachings. I speak the languages of your guardians and understand the purpose of your creation. I claim the right of succession." The clearing erupted in sound as hundreds of creatures emerged from the forest around her. Stalkers and shadowcats, behemoths and razorbacks, species she'd never seen before and others she'd fought desperately during her first visit. They formed concentric circles around the throne, their eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that sent chills down her spine. The largest behemoth, a creature that stood nearly 5 meters tall with scars covering its hide, stepped forward and spoke in a voice like an earthquake. "The first trial is acknowledged as complete air potential, but 3 challenges remain before the throne can be claimed. Will you face the trial of strength?" Sarah looked around at the assembled creatures, any one of which could kill her in seconds. Then she thought about the courtroom where she'd been condemned, the politicians who'd sacrificed her to protect their comfortable alliances, and the 37 colonists who had died while the Galactic Council played games. "I accept," she said. The behemoth's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth like curved daggers. "Then let the second trial begin." The behemoth that had challenged Sarah stood nearly 5 meters tall, its muscular frame covered in scars from countless battles. Its name, roughly translated, was Stonebreaker Who Feeds on Lightning, though Sarah suspected that was a title rather than an actual name. Its 6 limbs ended in claws that could punch through starship hull plating, and its mouth held teeth designed to crush bones. Sarah drew her combat knife, a pathetic weapon compared to the natural armaments facing her, but the only blade she had. The plasma rifle would be useless at close range, and something told her that projectile weapons weren't allowed in this particular trial. "The trial of strength has simple rules," Stonebreaker rumbled, his voice shaking dust from the crystallized throne behind Sarah. "Survive until the sun touches the western trees. Victory is not required, only endurance." Sarah nodded, noting how the assembled creatures had formed a perfect circle around them. Their eyes reflected intelligence and anticipation. This wasn't just a fight to them. It was a ritual with significance she was only beginning to understand. Stonebreaker didn't charge immediately, instead circling her with surprising grace for something his size. Sarah turned with him, keeping the knife low and ready. During her first visit to this world, she'd learned that human military combat training was almost useless against the planet's predators. They didn't follow human tactical patterns or respond to human psychological warfare, but they did respond to respect and cunning. "You move well for something so small," Stonebreaker observed, his massive head tilting as he studied her. "But strength is not measured in size alone." Sarah feinted left, then rolled right as the behemoth's claw swept through the air where her head had been. The movement created a wind that knocked her sideways, and she had to scramble to avoid the follow-up strike that cratered the ground beside her. "True," Sarah gasped, already breathing hard. "Strength comes in many forms." She had no illusions about winning this fight through direct confrontation. Stonebreaker outweighed her by several tons and could probably tear her in half without effort. But the trial wasn't about victory, it was about endurance. And endurance was something humans excelled at. Stonebreaker lunged forward, moving faster than something his size should be able to move. Sarah dove between his legs, scoring a shallow cut on his ankle with her knife. The blade barely penetrated his hide, but the behemoth stumbled slightly, more from surprise than injury. "First blood to the small fighter," called out a shadow cat from the circle. "Well struck." Sarah rolled to her feet and immediately had to duck as Stonebreaker's tail, a weapon she'd temporarily forgotten about, whistled through the space her torso had occupied. The appendage was thick as her waist and ended in a cluster of bone spikes. "You learn quickly," Stonebreaker admitted, "but learning and surviving are different skills." This time his attack was more calculated. Instead of lunging, he used his reach advantage to force Sarah backward toward the edge of the circle. Each swipe of his claws came closer to connecting, and Sarah found herself running out of room to maneuver. A stalker's voice called out from the crowd. "The small fighter retreats. Does she lack courage?" Sarah's jaw clenched. She understood what was happening now. This wasn't just a test of physical endurance. It was a test of her willingness to stand and fight when retreat seemed like the only option. Instead of backing away from Stonebreaker's next attack, Sarah stepped forward into it. She took a glancing blow from his claw across her left shoulder, the impact spinning her around and tearing her uniform. Blood flowed freely down her arm, but she was inside his guard now. Sarah drove her knife up toward the behemoth's throat, aiming for the soft spot beneath his jaw. Stonebreaker caught her wrist in his smaller front claws, stopping the blade centimeters from his hide. Better, he rumbled approvingly, but still not enough. He lifted her off the ground one-handed and hurled her across the clearing. Sarah hit the ground hard and rolled several times before coming to rest near the crystallized throne. Stars exploded behind her eyes and she tasted blood in her mouth. Stonebreaker didn't follow up immediately, instead waiting for her to regain her feet. Sarah used the respite to check her injuries. The shoulder wound was painful but not debilitating, and nothing seemed to be broken from the throw. Human endurance is legendary among the galaxy's species, Stonebreaker observed as Sarah stood. But legends can be false. Sarah wiped blood from her mouth and grinned. Then let me show you what's true. What followed was less a fight than a dance. Stonebreaker would attack, Sarah would evade and counterattack, then the cycle would repeat. Neither could seriously injure the other. Stonebreaker was too heavily armored for her knife to do real damage, while Sarah was too quick for him to land a solid blow. But that was the point. The trial of strength wasn't about who could hit hardest. It was about who could keep fighting longest. Sarah's military training finally became useful, not for its combat techniques, but for its conditioning. Hours of running with full pack, days without sleep during field exercises, the mental discipline to keep functioning when her body screamed for rest. All of it had prepared her for this moment. Stonebreaker began to slow first. His attacks became slightly less precise, his breathing heavier. Sarah was exhausted too, her legs shaking with fatigue and her shoulder throbbing, but she'd learned to push through pain and exhaustion during her first visit to this world. "You do not tire," Stonebreaker panted after nearly an hour of combat. "Are all humans so persistent?" "No," Sarah admitted, dodging another claw swipe. "But I've had good teachers." She gestured at the assembled creatures around them. During her first 3 weeks on this planet, every predator that hadn't killed her had taught her something valuable. How to ignore pain, how to keep moving when muscles screamed in protest, how to find strength she didn't know she had. The sun continued its arc across the sky. Sarah lost track of time, focused only on the next attack, the next evasion, the next small cut she could score on Stonebreaker's hide. Her knife was dull now from repeated impacts against his armored skin, and her uniform was in tatters. Finally, as the afternoon light began to slant through the western trees, Stonebreaker stepped back and lowered his claws. "Enough," he declared, his massive chest heaving. "The sun touches the western trees. The trial of strength is complete." Sarah nearly collapsed as the adrenaline drained from her system. Every muscle in her body ached and she was covered in cuts, bruises, and her own blood. But she remained standing as the assembled creatures voiced their approval in a chorus of roars, howls, and clicking sounds. Stonebreaker approached her slowly, his scarred head lowering until they were nearly eye to eye. "You fight like prey that has learned to be predator," he said quietly. "This is rare. This is valuable." He touched her forehead gently with one massive claw, a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and blessing. "The second trial is complete, heir potential. But greater challenges await. Are you prepared to face the trial of cunning?" Sarah looked around at the assembled creatures, noting how their posture toward her had changed. Before the fight, they had watched her with curiosity and mild interest. Now their eyes held something different: recognition, respect, the beginning of loyalty. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice was hoarse with exhaustion. A new voice spoke from the far side of the circle. Sarah turned to see a creature unlike any she'd encountered before. It stood on 2 legs like a human, but that was where the similarity ended. Its skin was a deep blue-black that seemed to absorb light, and its head was elongated with 6 eyes arranged in a complex pattern. When it moved, it seemed to flow like liquid shadow. "I am the maze walker who sees all paths," it announced in a voice like whispered secrets. "And your trial of cunning will begin at tomorrow's dawn. Tonight rest, heal. Prepare your mind for challenges that cannot be solved with strength or endurance alone." The creature melted back into the shadows between the trees, leaving Sarah alone in the center of the circle with the setting sun painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. She had passed 2 trials and survived combat with one of the planet's apex predators. But looking at the intelligent eyes surrounding her, Sarah knew the hardest tests were yet to come. The throne of Kepler 442b would not be claimed easily. But then again, nothing worthwhile ever was. Sarah spent the night in a shallow cave the creatures had shown her, tending her wounds and preparing for the next trial. Her shoulder had been carefully bandaged by a Shadowcat medic, a concept that would have seemed impossible during her first visit to this world. The planet's predators weren't just hunters. They were a complex society with specialized roles and ancient traditions. As dawn broke over the forest canopy, the maze walker who sees all paths materialized from the shadows like liquid darkness taking shape. Up close, Sarah could see that its skin wasn't just dark. It actually bent light around it, making it difficult to focus on the creature's exact outline. "The trial of cunning begins now," it announced in that whispered voice that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "Follow me, air potential, and prepare your mind for challenges that have broken the sanity of lesser beings." Sarah gathered her gear and followed the maze walker into the forest. They traveled for 2 hours through increasingly strange terrain. The trees grew closer together, their branches interweaving overhead until only thin shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on an almost liquid quality that made breathing difficult. Finally, they emerged into another clearing, but this one was completely different from the bone garden. Instead of open space, it contained a structure that hurt to look at directly. Walls of living stone twisted and curved in patterns that seemed to shift when observed from peripheral vision. Passages led in directions that shouldn't exist, and the entire structure hummed with an energy that made Sarah's teeth ache. "Behold the Mind Maze," the maze walker announced, created by the architects as the ultimate test of intelligence and problem-solving ability. 3 challenges await within its walls, each designed to break those who rely only on brute force or simple cunning. Sarah studied the entrance, an archway that seemed to be made of crystallized thought. The symbols carved around its edges were more complex than anything she'd encountered before, incorporating mathematical concepts and logical paradoxes that made her head spin. "What are the rules?" she asked. The maze walker's 6 eyes blinked in sequence. "There are no rules, only consequences. Enter the maze and face the 3 challenges. Solve them all before the sun sets or remain trapped within until your mind fractures and your body dies. Simple." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped through the archway. The world immediately changed around her. The forest, the maze walker, even the sun overhead vanished. She found herself standing in a corridor that stretched infinitely in both directions, its walls covered with equations and diagrams that seemed to writhe and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. A voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere, speaking in the language of the architects. "First challenge, the paradox of truth. In this corridor are 3 doors. One leads to the second challenge. One leads to certain death. One leads back to the beginning. Each door has a guardian who will make one statement about the doors. One guardian always lies, one always tells the truth. And one sometimes lies and sometimes tells the truth. You may ask 3 questions total. Choose correctly." 3 doors materialized along the left wall of the corridor. Before each one stood a creature that might have been one of the architects, though their forms were translucent and shifted like smoke. Sarah approached the first guardian, her mind already working through the logical implications. The classic 3-door paradox, but with a twist. The addition of the third guardian who sometimes lied made traditional solutions impossible. She would have to be cleverer than that. Sarah addressed the first guardian. "What would the second guardian say if I asked him whether your door leads to the second challenge?" The first guardian's smoky form rippled. "He would say it leads to death." Sarah moved to the second guardian. "What would the third guardian say if I asked her whether the first guardian's door leads to the second challenge?" "She would say it leads to the second challenge," the second guardian replied. For her final question, Sarah addressed the third guardian. "If I asked you whether your own door leads to the second challenge, would you say yes?" The third guardian considered for a long moment. "I would say yes." Sarah analyzed the responses carefully. If the first guardian always lied, then the second guardian would actually say the opposite of what the first guardian claimed. If the first guardian always told the truth, then the second guardian was lying about what he would say. The third guardian's response was a classic self-referential paradox that would force a truth-teller to lie or a liar to tell the truth. After 5 minutes of mental gymnastics, Sarah walked to the second door and pushed it open. The corridor beyond glowed with warm light, confirming her choice. She had correctly identified that the second guardian always lied, making the first guardian the truth-teller and the third guardian the sometimes liar. "First challenge complete," the voice announced. "Second challenge, the Memory Palace. You will be shown a sequence of events from the history of this world. Find the 3 deliberate falsifications hidden within the true memories, or be trapped forever in a loop of false history." The corridor transformed into a vast amphitheater filled with holographic displays. Sarah found herself watching the history of Kepler 442b unfold in vivid detail. She saw the architects in their prime, a graceful species with technology that bordered on magic. She witnessed their decision to create the testing ground and watched as they shaped every aspect of the planet's ecosystem. But as the history progressed, Sarah began to notice inconsistencies. Small details that didn't match what she'd learned from the symbols in the caves and the bone garden, a date that was off by several centuries, a description of the behemoths that contradicted their actual biology, a scene showing the architects using technology they hadn't developed until much later in their timeline. Finding the falsifications was like solving a 3-dimensional puzzle while the pieces constantly moved. Sarah had to hold the entire history of the planet in her mind while simultaneously analyzing each detail for accuracy. The mental strain was enormous and she felt a headache building behind her eyes. But her military training had taught her to analyze intelligence reports for inconsistencies, and her 3 weeks on the planet had given her intimate knowledge of its true nature. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, she identified the 3 falsifications and spoke them aloud. The amphitheater dissolved, replaced by another corridor. "Second challenge complete," the voice announced. "Final challenge, the test of understanding. You stand at the heart of the maze. Behind you lies the path you have traveled. Before you lies the path to the throne. But first you must demonstrate true understanding of what you have learned. Answer this question. Why did the architects create this world?" Sarah found herself in a circular chamber with walls covered in the combined knowledge of an entire civilization. Every symbol she had studied, every pattern she had analyzed, every piece of the puzzle she had collected during her time on Kepler 442b was displayed here. But the question wasn't asking for facts or data. It was asking for understanding, the deeper meaning behind the architect's actions. Sarah closed her eyes and let her mind wander through everything she had experienced. The trial by survival during her first visit, the combat with Stonebreaker, the complex puzzles of the maze. Each test had pushed her beyond her previous limits, forcing her to grow and adapt. The architects weren't just looking for someone strong enough to survive their world, she said aloud. They weren't looking for someone smart enough to solve their puzzles. They were looking for someone who could become more than they were before. The chamber waited silently for her to continue. Every species that reaches the stars eventually faces the same choice, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. They can remain what they always were, or they can evolve into something greater. The architects chose evolution, but they knew they wouldn't live to see it. So they created this world as a crucible, a place where any worthy species could be transformed into something capable of inheriting their legacy. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. Kepler 442b isn't just a Deathworld, it's a school. The predators aren't just killers, they're teachers. Every challenge, every battle, every moment of terror is designed to strip away weakness and reveal strength. Not just physical strength, but the strength to adapt, to learn, to grow beyond the limitations of what you were born to be. Sarah opened her eyes and looked directly at the center of the chamber, where a new symbol had appeared, one she had never seen before but somehow understood perfectly. The architects created this world because they believed that the universe needed guardians. Beings who had been tested beyond the breaking point and emerged stronger. They created a process that would take any species and forge them into something worthy of protecting all life in the galaxy. The chamber erupted in light so bright that Sarah had to shield her eyes. When the radiance faded, She found herself standing outside the maze with the sun still high overhead. The maze walker waited nearby, its form more solid and defined than before. Sarah woke to find herself surrounded by silence for the first time since arriving on Kepler 442b. No growling, no chittering, no distant roars echoing through the forest. The absence of sound was more unsettling than any predator's call. She emerged from her shelter to discover why. Hundreds of creatures had gathered during the night, forming concentric circles around her position. Every apex predator she had encountered was there, along with dozens of species she had never seen before. They sat motionless, watching her with intelligent eyes that held an expectation she wasn't sure she could fulfill. The maze walker materialized beside her, its form more solid in the morning light. The final trial begins at your word, air potential. But first understand what you face. Leadership is not claimed. It is earned through the willing submission of those who choose to follow. Today, you must prove that you deserve the loyalty of beings who have never bowed to anyone. Sarah looked out at the assembled creatures. In the front row sat Stonebreaker, who feeds on lightning, his massive form scarred but proud. Beside him crouched a Shadowcat Alpha, whose silver stripes gleamed in the dawn light. Stalkers with their color-shifting hides stood motionless as statues, while packs of Razorbacks maintained perfect formation despite their usually chaotic nature. What exactly is required? Sarah asked. Lead them, the maze walker replied simply. The Northern Territories are under attack by an invasive species that threatens the balance of our world. Creatures from beyond the stars have established a foothold there and are spreading their corruption. Command our forces. Drive out the invaders. Prove that your tactical mind can direct beings who have never known defeat. Sarah felt her breath catch. Invasive species? You mean, yes, the maze walker confirmed. Your own people have returned air potential. A military expedition seeking to establish a research base. They believe this world is empty of intelligent life, and they are prepared to kill anything that threatens their mission. The irony was bitter as poison. Sarah had been exiled here as punishment for defending human colonists, and now she would have to fight against human soldiers to prove her worthiness to rule. She stepped forward, addressing the assembled creatures in their own languages. Warriors of Kepler 442b, I accept the responsibility of command. But I will not lead you into battle without first attempting diplomacy. These invaders are my own species. If possible, I would prefer to resolve this without bloodshed. A rumble of disapproval swept through the crowd. Stonebreaker rose to his full height, his voice carrying across the clearing. The invaders have already spilled blood. They killed a pride of young Shadowcats who approached their settlement in peace. They destroyed a grove of singing trees that had stood for 1,000 years. Their machines poisoned the very air with their presence. Sarah's jaw tightened. Diplomatic solutions were becoming less likely by the minute, but she had to try. Then we will give them one chance to leave peacefully. If they refuse, she looked around at the assembled predators, calculating numbers and capabilities with a tactical mind honed by 15 years of military service. What she saw both thrilled and terrified her. The galaxy's most formidable military force, waiting for her command. If they refuse, we will show them why this world was designated as forbidden. The war council that followed was unlike anything in human military history. Sarah found herself planning an assault with creatures whose capabilities far exceeded any weapon system she had ever commanded. The Shadowcats could infiltrate any position undetected. The Stalkers could disable electronic equipment with bioelectric pulses. The Behemoths could punch through armor that would stop tank rounds, but coordinating them would be the challenge. Each species had its own tactical preferences, its own methods of warfare, its own pride that could not be ignored. Sarah had to find a way to blend their individual strengths into a cohesive fighting force. The Razorbacks will approach from the east, she announced, pointing to positions on a crude map scratched in the dirt. Your spine launchers can disable their vehicles from long range without killing the occupants. The Shadowcats will infiltrate their perimeter and sabotage their communication equipment. I want them isolated and confused, but not slaughtered. A Razorback pack leader bristled. You ask us to fight with blunted claws. Why show mercy to invaders who showed none to our young? Because mercy from a position of strength demonstrates true power, Sarah replied, meeting the creature's gaze steadily. Any fool can kill. It takes wisdom to know when killing is necessary and when it is waste. Stonebreaker nodded approvingly. The small commander thinks like an architect. This is good. The march to the northern territories took most of the day. Sarah rode on Stonebreaker's back, which felt surreal but was practical given his stride length. Around them, the forest came alive with movement as hundreds of predators moved through the trees with coordinated precision. As they traveled, Sarah found herself thinking about the human soldiers they were approaching. They were probably just following orders, trying to establish a foothold on what they believed was an empty world. Most of them had no idea they were invading a planet inhabited by intelligent species, but some of them would know. The mission commanders would have access to the classified files about her trial and exile. They would know that someone had survived on this world for 3 weeks, which meant survival was possible, yet they had chosen to establish their base anyway. The human settlement came into view as the sun began to set. It was a standard military outpost, prefabricated buildings arranged in a defensive square, with sensor arrays and automated weapon systems providing perimeter security. Sarah counted perhaps 50 people moving around the compound, along with several shuttlecraft and heavy equipment vehicles. "Remember," she told her assembled forces as they took positions in the forest around the settlement, "we try diplomacy first. If that fails, disable but don't destroy. These people are ignorant, not evil." Sarah walked alone toward the settlement's main gate, her hands raised in the universal gesture of peaceful approach. The automated weapon systems tracked her movement but didn't fire. Motion sensors had probably detected the creatures hidden in the forest, but the humans would dismiss them as local wildlife. A voice called out from behind the compound's walls, "Halt! Identify yourself." "Commander Sarah Chen, formerly of the United Earth Space Navy," Sarah called back. "I need to speak with your commanding officer." Silence for a long moment. Then the gate opened and a squad of soldiers emerged, their weapons drawn but not aimed directly at her. Their leader was a woman Sarah didn't recognize, wearing the insignia of a colonial marine captain. "Captain Rodriguez," the woman introduced herself. "You're supposed to be dead, Commander. Or worse." "I'm very much alive," Sarah replied, "and I'm here to give you a choice. Pack up your equipment and leave this world immediately, or face the consequences of trespassing on sovereign territory." Captain Rodriguez laughed. "Sovereign territory? This is a dead rock, Commander. Nothing lives here but microbes and predators." "The predators are more intelligent than you realize," Sarah said quietly, "and they don't appreciate visitors who kill their young." The captain's expression changed. "We defended ourselves against attacking animals. Standard protocol for hostile wildlife." "Those animals were approaching under a flag of truce," Sarah replied. "You murdered diplomats." "You're insane," Rodriguez said flatly. "Exile has broken your mind, Commander. Stand down and submit to custody. We'll get you the medical help you need," Sarah sighed. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but some people only understood one language. She raised her voice, speaking in the deep, rumbling tones of the behemoth language. "The offer of mercy is refused. Begin the demonstration." The forest around the settlement erupted into motion. Shadow cats materialized from empty air inside the compound, their claws sparking against electronic equipment. Razorbacks emerged from the tree line, their metallic spines whistling through the air to puncture vehicle tires and disable weapons systems. Stalkers rose from concealment, their bioelectric pulses shorting out everything electronic within 50 meters. The humans fought back, but their weapons were designed for fighting other humans. Plasma bolts that should have been lethal barely singed the thick hides of the attacking predators. Armor that could stop conventional bullets crumpled under claws evolved to tear through materials harder than steel. Within 10 minutes, the settlement was completely overrun. Not a single human had been killed, but they were all disarmed and surrounded by creatures that could have slaughtered them in seconds. Captain Rodriguez stared at Sarah in shock. How is this possible?" "I told you," Sarah replied, switching back to English. "This world is sovereign territory. I am its ruler, and these are my subjects. You have 10 minutes to gather your essential gear and board your shuttles. Leave everything else." "You can't be serious," Rodriguez protested. "This is a colonial marine base. We have authorization." "Your authorization is worthless here," Sarah interrupted. "This world is under new management." She gestured to Stonebreaker, who approached with ground-shaking steps. The massive behemoth lowered his head until he was eye level with Captain Rodriguez. 6 months after claiming the throne of Kepler 442b, Sarah Chen stood in the command chamber she had built at the heart of the Bone Garden. The crystallized remains of the original architect throne had been carefully moved to form the centerpiece of a larger structure that blended ancient technology with practical military command needs. Holographic displays showed the positions of her forces across the planet, while communication systems linked her to every major predator pack and territorial alpha. The planet had changed under her rule. What had once been a chaotic ecosystem of competing apex predators had become something resembling a civilization. The Shadowcats had established a communications network that spanned continents. The behemoths had become her heavy infantry, organized into companies that could coordinate their movements across vast distances. Even the smallest predator species had found roles to play in the growing society. But today, all of that progress would be put to the ultimate test. Long-range sensors detect incoming vessels, reported Swift Killer of the Eastern Peaks, a stalker who had become Sarah's chief intelligence officer. 47 ships of various classes approaching at standard military formation. Sarah nodded grimly. She had been expecting this for months. The colonial marines who had been driven from the planet would have filed reports. The Galactic Council would have deliberated, and eventually, they would have decided that losing control of an entire world was unacceptable. Composition analysis? She asked. 12 heavy cruisers, 20 destroyers, 15 assault transports. Swift Killer replied, his color-shifting hide displaying the tactical information and visual patterns. Estimated troop strength, 5,000 Marines plus support personnel. They come prepared for extended warfare. Stonebreaker who feeds on. Lightning entered the command chamber, his massive bulk somehow moving silently across the stone floor. The prides are in position, Air Queen. All territorial alphas report ready for combat. The young have been moved to the deep caves as you commanded. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. These creatures had accepted her leadership, trusted her tactical judgment, followed her into battle against her own species. Now she was about to ask them to do it again, on a scale that dwarfed their previous engagement. Open a communication channel to the approaching fleet, she ordered. The holographic display shifted to show the bridge of the lead cruiser. Admiral Torres appeared, looking older and more tired than Sarah remembered from her court-martial. Her former commanding officer's face showed no surprise at seeing her alive. He had probably hoped this confrontation could be avoided. Commander Chen, he said formally. Or should I say, Your Majesty? The reports from Captain Rodriguez's expedition were illuminating. Admiral Torres, Sarah replied. I prefer Sarah. Titles are for ceremonial occasions, and this isn't one of them. Indeed not. Torres leaned back in his command chair, his expression unreadable. Sarah, you need to understand the position you've put us in. An entire world, claimed by a single human being with the backing of what the xenobiologists are calling impossible evolutionary developments. The Council is terrified. Sarah smiled without humor. They should be. You were once one of our best officers, Torres continued. Your service record was exemplary right up until your final mission. But this has gone too far. You're harboring a military force capable of threatening the stability of the entire galactic order. The stability of an order built on lies and political convenience, Sarah shot back. How many worlds have been designated as forbidden simply because claiming them would be inconvenient for existing trade relationships? How many species have been written off as non-intelligent because recognizing their sentience would complicate colonial expansion? That's not your decision to make, Torres replied. You're one person, Sarah. One human being who has somehow convinced a planet full of predators to follow you. But you're still just one person, am I? Sarah gestured around the command chamber, where dozens of different species worked alongside each other with perfect coordination. Or am I the voice of something larger? Something the Council would rather pretend doesn't exist? She leaned forward, her voice taking on the authority she had learned from commanding beings who could kill her with a thought. Admiral, you have one opportunity to avoid a bloodbath that will be remembered for centuries. Withdraw your fleet. Recognize Kepler 442b as sovereign territory under my rule. Accept that the age of unopposed expansion is over. Torres was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with regret. You know I can't do that, Sarah. I have my orders. The Council won't accept the loss of this world, and they certainly won't accept the precedent of a human claiming rulership over an entire planet through Alliance with indigenous species. Then, you've chosen war with beings who have spent millennia perfecting the art of killing, Sarah replied. I hope your orders are worth the lives you're about to lose. She cut the communication and turned to her assembled commanders. Representatives of every major species on the planet filled the chamber, their eyes fixed on her with complete attention. You heard the conversation, Sarah announced. They come to take our world by force, to reduce you to the status of mindless beasts, to strip mine our home for resources. What is your response? The answer came as a chorus of voices in a dozen different languages, but the meaning was universal. War. Total war against the invaders who refused to recognize their right to exist. Sarah nodded and activated the planet-wide communication system. All forces, this is Queen Sarah. The invasion fleet will reach orbit in 6 hours. Execute Defense Protocol Omega. Show them what happens when someone threatens our home. What followed was unlike any military engagement in recorded history. The humans expected to face primitive predators driven by instinct and territorial aggression. Instead, they encountered a coordinated defense that had been planned and prepared by minds both human and utterly alien. The first wave of assault shuttles met stalker packs equipped with captured human weapons, modified by architect technology to be far more effective than their original designs. Bioelectric pulses disabled entire squadrons of fighters before they could reach the surface. Shadowcat infiltration teams materialized aboard the larger ships, sabotaging critical systems with precision that spoke of detailed intelligence gathering. But the real shock came when the orbital bombardment began. The humans had expected their superior firepower to give them an overwhelming advantage. Instead, they discovered that Kepler 442b had defensive systems that predated their civilization by millennia. Ancient weapons platforms, hidden in the planet's crust and activated by Sarah's command, rose from the surface to engage the attacking fleet. Energy beams that could punch through starship armor lit up the space around the planet as the architect's final gift to their successors came online. The battle raged for 3 days. Human military training and superior technology met creatures evolved for warfare and backed by science that seemed like magic. Ships burned in orbit while on the surface. Marines found themselves fighting enemies that could appear from nowhere, strike with impossible force, and vanish back into terrain that actively hindered human movement. On the 3rd day, Admiral Torres requested a ceasefire. Sarah met him in the same clearing where she had faced the trial of strength. The Admiral came alone as she had requested, while the forest around them rustled with the presence of creatures whose loyalty she had earned through trial and leadership. Torres looked around at the assembled predators with a mixture of fear and awe. 60% casualties, he said quietly. More than half my fleet is gone or crippled. And you've barely taken any losses at all. We fight on our home ground, Sarah replied, with perfect knowledge of the terrain and complete coordination between our forces. This was never going to end any other way. The Council will never accept this defeat, Torres warned. They'll send more ships, bigger fleets. Eventually, they'll use weapons that could crack this planet open rather than let it fall into unauthorized hands. Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Admiral, do you really think the rulers of 47 different species are going to authorize the destruction of an entire world? Do you think they can afford to set the precedent that the Galactic Council will commit genocide rather than negotiate? She gestured to Stonebreaker, who approached carrying something that made Torres take an involuntary step backward. It was a data crystal, but not like any human technology. The crystalline structure seemed to contain swirling galaxies of light, and looking at it too long made the eyes water. This contains detailed records of your attack on our world, Sarah continued. Video evidence of your military targeting civilian populations. Proof that the Council authorized warfare against intelligent species who were defending their sovereign territory. Every major news network in the galaxy will receive copies within the hour. Torres stared at the crystal in horror. You're talking about destabilizing the entire galactic government. I'm talking about forcing them to live up to their own stated principles, Sarah corrected. The Galactic Accords guarantee the right of intelligent species to self-determination. We're simply insisting that those rights be respected. She moved closer to Torres, her voice dropping to a conversational level. Admiral, you have a choice. You can retreat with your surviving ships and recommend that the Council open diplomatic negotiations with the sovereign world of Kepler 442b. Or you can continue this war and watch as every species in the galaxy questions whether their own worlds might be next if they displease the Council's political interests. Torres, was silent for a long time, looking around at the predators that watched him with intelligent eyes. Finally he spoke. What are your terms? Full recognition of Kepler 442b as an independent world under my rule, Sarah replied immediately. Establishment of formal diplomatic relations. And most importantly, a new classification system that actually recognizes intelligence when it's found, instead of dismissing it as inconvenient. And in return, Sarah smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in her expression. In return, the galaxy gets a new ally. A world full of beings who have spent millennia learning how to protect what they value. We're not interested in conquest or expansion, Admiral. We just want to be left alone to build something better than what came before. Torres nodded slowly. I'll need to consult with Earth Command and the Council. Of course, Sarah replied. You have 72 hours. After that, I start broadcasting the battle records to every inhabited system in the galaxy. As Torres's shuttle disappeared into the sky, Sarah felt Stonebreaker's presence beside her. Do you think they will accept, Air Queen? The massive behemoth asked. Sarah looked around at the creatures who had followed her through 4 trials, trusted her leadership in battle, and helped her build something unprecedented in galactic history. A society where intelligence was respected regardless of its form, where strength was used to protect rather than conquer, where the old divisions between species meant less than the bonds forged through shared struggle. They'll accept, she said confidently, because the alternative is watching their entire political system collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy. She walked back toward the command chamber, her mind already turning to the challenges of establishing formal diplomatic relations and building the infrastructure needed to support a truly multi-species civilization. Sarah Chen had been sent to Kepler 442b as punishment for defending the innocent. She had returned as the queen of the most dangerous world in the galaxy, backed by creatures who had chosen to follow her not out of fear, but out of respect for the strength she had shown and the wisdom she had earned. The girl who had been exiled to die had become the woman who would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy, and she was just getting started.